Hello, I'm Caroline Phipps, and I'm here in Millerton, New York, and with Joe Gosler at the Millerton Library. He is the author of the wonderful memoir, Searching for Home. Joe, tell us what you're expecting today in Millerton.
Well, first of all, I expect hordes of people to fill this wonderful space. But in essence, what I hope is that people come away having learned a little bit firsthand of the experience of what it was like being an infant during the war, being hidden, and the fact that after the war, I was returned to my biological parents. But who were these strangers who call themselves my parents? And that, in its own way, begins another war altogether, because it is the turmoil that I go through throughout my life in some fashion because of the impact of war and my personal experience within it.
Well, thank you so much, Joe. I feel today as if the telling of this story and the keeping of this flame is more important than ever. And so I would like to thank you for sharing your experiences and for writing this wonderful memoir.
Thank you very much. I do hope that the people see that even though wars are never pleasant, that they are not unique, and they connect over time with events that are similar, even though the players may be different. The actual dynamic of war is very much the same. It's some people being persecuted, others dominating, and sometimes people who are persecuted and those who are the dominant are the same.
I think at the end of the day, we all become victims, don't we, when we turn on one another?
Absolutely. War is an exaggeration of who we are, and it just illuminates all of what we are, and that means as humans we are capable of anything and everything, and that includes the horrors that are usually affiliated with war.
And I also think, too, that often it can ironically bring out the very best in people, like the Dutch family that took you in when you were a child.
Yeah.
What could be more powerful and courageous and compassionate than that?
Yeah, I'm not even sure exactly what compelled them to take me in. As a family, they were social democratic, which is fairly moderate. It's maybe liberal considered, but these were just human beings, and they were empathic, and even had their own children, and yet felt whatever they could do, they needed to pitch in and help. And were just amazingly important in saving me. Yeah.
So, Joe, what a wonderful space here at the Millerton Library.
Yeah, absolutely. The Northeast-Millerton Library is a special place. It's not only inviting in the most normal of ways, but it's a center for children as well as adults. And they have spaces that can be used for all sorts of meaningful community functions. And I invite one and all to speak to the librarian, Rhiannon Leo Jameson, and welcome.
Well, thank you for sharing your story with us, Joe. And everybody
welcome.
Needs to be reading Searching for Home.
Thank you very much.
Joe Gosler.
Thank you. Dear friends, thank you for showing up. I'm clearly competing with wonderful weather outside. And so I'd like to tell you a little bit about the program. There is a video that we're going to show. It's about 16 minutes long. It summarizes my book as well as my life. It's a storytelling event that actually occurred last August through the Ancram Opera House, and they have something called Real People, Real Stories. It's similar to, some of you may have listened to NPR's North Hour, and it's like that. It's regular people going on stage telling a story without cue cards or anything, which I found very challenging, but somehow it worked, I think. So that's one item that we're going to have, and then I'm going to read a few excerpts from the book, and then I'm going to open it up to questions that you may have. And at the end, if you can tolerate it, I'd appreciate it. There will be an exit interview in terms of how you felt about the gathering and the event, and hopefully whatever you gained out of the book. So I'll begin by saying that I'm Joe Gosler, but my name actually was different in different phases of my life. I was Jos Gosler at birth, or Josje Gosler if you want to make it more appropriate for a baby. And then I was Peter Dijkstra while in hiding. And thereafter, I was Joseph and Yusef, and in America, I was Joe Gosler. And it's interesting that they're just names, but they're so representative. Somehow, they all baked together and formed who I am. Let me first say thank you to Rhiannon Leo James, a wonderful librarian, for supporting this event and this lovely venue. And let me also quickly thank Alex Lage and Caroline Phipps for being involved with the filming and the exit interview. So as I started saying, we made this story that I gave as one of 4 people last year. And by coincidence, the Ancram Opera House, and this is a plug for them without them even knowing, this evening has a show of 4 other people giving their stories of their lives' experiences. So I wouldn't mind if you put it on now, and we'll just watch it. I'm going to move to one of the seats while we do that.
So up next, a storyteller from Ancramdale. And he's telling a story about the impact of war on a toddler hidden during World War II in the Netherlands. Please welcome to the stage Joe Gosler.
Greetings. It was 1975, and I lived on the Lower East Side in a tenement flat above a bar. And I couldn't sleep that night, and finally I did. And suddenly I was just rudely awakened to the sound of music, loud music. And it got louder still, so much so that the floor and walls began to vibrate. And then it went from there, but suddenly I heard someone yelling, "Last dance." And I couldn't fall asleep after that. In fact, I barely slept for 9 months thereafter. But it wasn't just the music. Inside of me, there were tidal waves of anxiety washing over every pore and crevice of my body. I was born in 1942 in the Netherlands during World War II, and I'm Jewish. And at the age of 7 months, my parents decided it's best to place me in hiding. And so a nursing student arrives from the Dutch resistance, and she bundles me up, and we vanish into the night. My parents go into hiding as well, with false identities. They move to the countryside until they are caught and beaten severely. And then my father is shipped to a transition camp called Westerbork. And my mother, who was blue-eyed and fair-skinned, was threatened and basically told that if she ever associated with Jews again, she would be killed. In contrast, I was placed at a family whose name is Dijkstra, Moeder and Vader Dijkstra. And this is a Protestant family with 2 young daughters named Anneke and Foley. And they loved me. They cared for me. They nurtured me. And I bonded with them. And this was the only family I truly knew. The war ends. I'm 3 years old. My parents, after a frantic search, find me. But who were these strangers who called themselves my parents? I was totally uprooted, confused, angry, and I promptly burned the bathroom curtains. And then I wander off from time to time in search of my real parents. This goes on for a while. Later on, in 45, my sister is born. And a few weeks after that, my parents bring home a puppy, and we name him Whitey. And Whitey and me were like that. I just loved the dog. He was not only my playmate, he protected me. And he gave me the nurturing that my parents couldn't. In 1949, the war's recession was still raging, and my parents could no longer tolerate the nightmares that they had. And so we go to Israel. But I couldn't take Whitey with me or my neighborhood. In Israel, we're placed in a kibbutz called Bet Ashita, and on the kibbutz, the children lived separately in a dorm. And that was a blessing to me because I was still very much in turmoil. I needed the distance from my parents at that time. And I was the Dutch boy. I was the outsider. And I got into a lot of fights. And I never wanted to tell my parents about that because I never wanted them to ever worry again. But one evening, when I was invited to dinner at their house, my father noticed the bruises on my face and he said, "What happened to you, son?" And I said very quickly, "Oh, I fell into a hole." And he said equally quickly, "Well, next time carry a big stick with you." And within months thereafter, some of the very kids that I had fights with became my friends. And slowly but surely, I really folded into the rhythm of that community. I was recognized. I was part of it, and I loved it. And my father loved it too, as did my sister. But my mother was absolutely outraged because she had to share her children with that larger community, especially her son. And so 4 years later, we are bound for America, but we first stay at temporary housing where my uncle finds a litter of fox terrier dogs under his bungalow. And he gives us one, and we promptly call her Gura. And Gura and I were inseparable. Wherever I went, she would follow. And on the last day, when we took the bus that would take us to the ship and to America, I'm sitting in the back of the bus, and I look through the rear window, and I see her running after the bus as long as she could. It was 1953, and I'm 11, and we're in Rockaway Park at a house where other aunts and uncles stayed before us. And my father gets a job in the garment industry, and my mother begins to clean homes. And I start picking empty bottles off the beach, and in that process, I saw all of the happiness on the faces of people. And the more I saw that, the more alone I felt. And I longed to be back in Israel. 2 years after that, we move again. And I realized that each time we move, the old emotional scars are peeled open again, and new wounds are forming. On this occasion, my father got a job as a supervisor at a large chicken farm in Monticello, New York. And so we moved. A couple of years later, I finally clicked the social scene. I'm involved. And I actually excel in sports, and so I become somewhat popular. And my parents insist at that very moment, I think you need to start helping in the house. And so I got a job after school, and my self-esteem vanishes. At the same time, we get a letter from Holland that Moeder Dijkstra died. Now, I had not been directly in contact with her for 10 years, but I was overwhelmed with grief. And no matter what my parents tried to do, they couldn't console me. A few years after that, I graduate, I'm 18, and we move again. We're moving to Queens to the very same house. And the reason was that we wanted to be near, or my parents wanted to be nearer to our extended family. And I saw this as a great opportunity to leave the house, finally. But my parents had other thoughts, and I continued to contribute half of my salary for another half dozen years. But at 21, I bolted out of the house and moved in with my cousin Andy. And he introduced me to a world, an avant-garde world that I never knew existed. And I stopped working immediately and only worked sporadically for the next 12 years. And I started performing with the Bread and Puppet Theater. I'm on all of the anti-war marches and picket lines, and I travel extensively, dabble in drugs. I'm flying, literally. And I knew this was a time to actually begin focusing on myself, but I really couldn't do it at that moment in my life. I needed to be unburdened and free. And so thereafter, I meet Sheila, my future wife, and we start dating, and eventually we started living together and decided that we should go on a big trip. So a year goes by and we amass $5,000, and we buy 2 round-trip tickets that were good for a year, some camping gear, and we're off to Europe, to Holland in particular, because my parents in the interim moved back to Holland. And we stay with them for a while, but then we hitch our way to Morocco. because there's a hippie colony near a fishing village along the Atlantic. And I truly felt on top of the moment. 9 months later, we returned to the States, continue our lives, but Sheila is getting more serious about her future. I resist all of that. I just want to continue flying on my magic carpet. 2 years go by, and we're visiting my parents in Amsterdam, and we're crossing the street, and I extend my arm to my mother and say, "Hey, why don't you grab that as we cross?" And she pushes my arm away and says, "I don't need you. I can cross the road by myself." And for some reason, it just rips me apart. And it really sends me in a downward spiral. It's 1975, and I live on the Lower East Side of Manhattan in a tenement flat above a bar. And I can't sleep for fear that I would not wake up. When I ate, I worried about gagging. I was totally vulnerable, and I felt everything on a visceral level. My sister and Sheila encouraged me to go into therapy. I distrusted therapies. I distrusted so many things. But I do it for them. I go into therapy. And I'm in therapy for 8 months or so, and one of the people in it suddenly yells at me, "Stop wasting my time." Well, I was totally embarrassed, but it was a wake-up call. And things started to percolate. I got involved, and I started to localize my feelings. For the first time, I was able to focus anger at my parents. You see, until that time, I rationalized why they had to give me away. They needed to give me away for my safety as well as theirs. Now, I could actually feel that sense of abandonment. I could feel depression. I could feel love. And I was able to share that feeling of love with Sheila in a different way than ever before. And it suddenly dawned on me that I was able to put my past into perspective. It no longer overwhelmed me. And I was convinced that I could change. So soon thereafter, I trimmed my hair. It was quite long. And I had a wild mustache, and I shaved that off and got an adult job working at a preschool as a business manager. And 3 years later, in 1980, I became an American citizen and, in fact, welcomed my parents back to live in the States, which they did. And then found a defining job of my career, which was working as the business manager of Friends Seminary, a Quaker independent school in Lower Manhattan. And I loved the collegiality of that place and totally admired their Quaker underpinnings. A few months after that, our son Jake was born. And a couple of years after that, Sheila and I founded a school, a preschool called Beginnings Nursery. And Jake, in fact, started attending Friends. And so suddenly, I became aware of the fact that all that was meaningful to me, my family, my work, was within a one-block radius, a small village, if you will. And I realized I was no longer fragmented and was becoming whole. About 15 years ago, I retired from Friends, and the first thing that we did was get a dog. And the dog's name, we named him Milton. And it was the most precious time that I had with him for 11 years. And he died staring into my eyes. Today, I write, I'm involved in some Quaker projects, I love to cook as well as eat, and garden, but most importantly, I walk our new dog, Reuben. Thank you. So at the time that I was born in 1942, Holland had already been occupied for 2 years. And what was significant about that time was that the Nazi regime was still wearing their velvet gloves. They were not showing their knuckles as it related to the final solution of how to kill Jews, and most particularly children, because children are the future. And if you can knock them off, obviously, there's an end to all of that. I would say that out of, and so ironically, I should add, on the surface, things were relatively normal. People had jobs, went shopping. Within limited hours, they could go out at night. But there were also the raids every night that plucked away not only Jews, but homosexuals and disabled people, communists, and resistance fighters. And I would say within 4 months after I was born, in the middle of 42, the real serious program of the Nazis began with daily trains going to the transition camp called Westerbork, from which then they went to the quote-unquote brand name concentration camps like Auschwitz and Sobibor and so forth. And I would say that in March of 43 was when, in fact, I was placed in hiding, where my parents really thought it was best for them, and of course for me, if we moved separately. And what was somewhat ironic about it was that my parents were traveling with my maternal grandmother, who had difficulty walking and in almost stereotypical manner was just slow. But somehow they felt that was better to take a risk on than with a young 7-month-old. I will also end this little part by saying that at the end of the war, 110,000 Jews had been removed from Holland, extricated, and only 5,000 returned. That's how efficient the Nazis were. And there were about 25,000 people hidden, including myself, and that was turned out to be a little bit more successful in that 17,000 of that 25 were able to come back and continue their lives. So let me begin with actually the prologue, which I had written like 35 years ago for a totally different purpose. It's called "The Cobblestones Were Washed Each Morning." The cobblestones were washed each morning. The streets built for horse and buggy travel did not support modern times. The advent of the automobile and airplane were symbols of this new age. The thick mist of the 1930s was lifting, and with the Depression fading, new hopes and new political roots were becoming more entrenched. The cobblestones were washed each morning. The air was mired with optimism. Children played in the streets while their parents rushed off to work. Very few people took the time to look beyond their own gardens. If they did, they disassociated themselves from what they saw and heard. The rise of Nazi power was evident everywhere. Shops vandalized, books burnt, cemeteries and places of worship desecrated, people beaten in the street. Few questioned these onslaughts against the Jews, feeling, why should we care? They are not like us. There was a myopic sense of trust and belief that things would work out, that this too would pass. They wished for a future that was well managed, orderly, with a single culture and political vision, a vision that excluded me. The cobblestones were washed each morning. The traffic in the streets was now a mixture of people rushing everywhere, a few automobiles, and many trucks, soldiers, and tanks. At dusk, people would come home from work with their groceries, listen to the radio, and because of curfews, rarely went out at night. Many Jews went into hiding. They hid wherever they could, in closets, attics, haylofts, and forests, or they obtained false identity papers and blended in. The Nazi boot was everywhere, and you could not trust anyone. Mistakes were fatal. The cobblestones were washed each morning. The parade of Nazi boots are gone. The war ended. The trucks and tanks are gone, and people rush into the streets to celebrate and forget. They stand on the souls of the dead. So I have to improvise my listings. Okay, so now I'm going to read from a chapter which not only when I was placed in hiding, but also sadly when I lost my grandmother. At 7 or 8 months old, at an age when an infant can barely see beyond his mother's breast, I was taken from my parents by the Dutch resistance to places unknown. One evening in March 1943, a nursing student on a bicycle with a straw basket attached came to our house, bundled me in a blanket, placed me in the basket, and pedaled off into the darkness. Much later in my life, my parents recounted their feelings of being in a state of controlled fear and numbness, full of remorse, and yet relieved. They hoped I would be safe, although there was no guarantee that they would ever see me again. And so this is the part about when my parents traveled with my maternal grandmother, Martha. My parents and Oma Marta, Oma means grandmother, decided to travel to Gelderland, an agricultural province southeast of Amsterdam. There they hoped to work and hide on one of the many small farms which dotted the fertile plains. The distance between Amsterdam and Gelderland is less than 50 miles, and even by foot should not take more than 2 days to travel. Each day they traveled at dawn, each carrying valises filled with their meager belongings and keepsakes. They stayed off main roads and looked for shelter and food for the evening to come. The journey was particularly hard on my grandmother, who found it difficult to walk long distances. One night, while sleeping in a small barn, my mother awoke, convinced that their host had informed on them and told of the whereabouts of the SS police. The premonition meant that they had to leave immediately. My grandmother felt that she needed more time to rest and decided that she would meet them later that day. Sadly, they never saw her again, and later learned that she was taken by the SS, deported, and murdered in Sobibor. When I got older, I became painfully aware, as had my parents, that intuition and timing could spell the difference between life and death, and that ironically, we were born under lucky stars. So while in hiding, this is an experience I had when I got my first haircut. I was about to, and let me see what page that's on, 21. I'm told that I was 2 years old when slowly but determinedly I walked to town with Father. We were going to the barber shop, and I was excited about my first haircut, although I grimaced with fear when the barber approached. He was going to cut my hair, which after all was part of my body. But when the first curls fell like feathers drifting to the floor, I relaxed and enjoyed the sensation until the rumbling sounds of tanks rolling over uneven cobblestones made me jerk my head to see what was happening outside. The smells and sounds of diesel-fed trucks and the rhythmic thud of leather boots made everyone in the shop turn towards the street. Suddenly, I yelled, "Rotmuffen!" Hands came flying from every direction to cup my mouth and drag me to the back room. I was innocently mimicking what Mutter and Father said in the quiet of their home about the occupiers and when they marched past our home. The men in the barbershop were much relieved when the parade of helmets and leather boots marched on in their robot-like rhythm without coming to a halt. Yelling rotten Nazis, even by a child of 2, could mean death. On another occasion, while I was playing outside, another incident happened when it came to the German military. One day, while playing with other young children in the street, a platoon of Nazi soldiers and tanks came rolling down the street. All the other children scampered to the sides, but whether numb, curious, dumb, or defiant, I remained in the middle of the road. Other children yelled for me to move to one side or the other, but I stood frozen. Miraculously, the troops with their armaments divided from one stream into 2 as they passed me by. Mutter witnessed all of this from the front yard, and when she ran to retrieve me, they had already passed. These were perilous times, but for me, from my 2-year-old eyes, it was part of everyday experience. So, as I noted in the video, in 1949, I guess I was about six and a half, we decided that we could no longer tolerate, or my parents certainly could no longer tolerate living, not only because of the economic recession, post-war recession in Holland, but if every cobblestone could talk, they would hear the moans and wailings of people being dragged out on the street at night, and others behind curtains, either listening or watching as well. They just couldn't tolerate living there, and so they applied to go to the U.S., but the line to the U.S. was so long, the waiting time was so long, that they decided they had to leave, and instead they went to Israel. And so I just want to read, it's a small segment, the experience on this boat. To me, at age 6, the train ride was a blur. But my memory of the ship voyage from Marseille was another matter. We traveled on a cargo ship bound for Haifa. The passengers, like us, were Jewish Holocaust survivors. We slept in steerage, an open space in the bottom of the ship where we were packed in with many other families. Metal beds, suitcases, and buckets. There was always a long line for the single bathroom. The trip took 5 days, and the memory of a single stormy night is etched in my mind. The storm jolted the normal chaos into a horrific scene that lasted for several hours. Suitcases slid from one side of steerage to the other. Buckets of urine spilled all over the floor. Beds rattled like chattering teeth, and babies cried incessantly as the flickering lights created a haunting disco light show. In retrospect, I cannot imagine the humiliation they felt, the lack of privacy, the pervasive and lingering odors, coupled with the cries of infants. How different was it from the atmosphere in the cattle cars going to the camps? So, when we moved to Israel, we stayed on a kibbutz. It was a politically left-wing kibbutz, a Mapam kibbutz, therefore, called Bet HaShita, and it today actually is extremely well known, not only within Israel but outside of it, as a pickle capital of the world. They make a lot of pickle and pickle-related products. So this is my experience after the first 6 months. The first 6 months were quite horrific. I was the outsider, the Dutch boy, and as noted on the video, I got into quite a few little fights and so forth. But thereafter, things got actually quite lovely. I learned the language quickly. I was fluent in Hebrew in less than a year, and Beersheba, who was the librarian, who I was very close to, was no longer central in my life. My childhood, that until then at best had been uneven, now flourished. I felt as though a major weight had been lifted off my shoulders and that my calloused feet floated above the ground. A burst of energy not experienced before enveloped me. New friendships formed, adolescent adventures abounded. It was an exhilarating time. A series of adventures followed, one more exciting than the next. With a gaggle of friends, I explored the many caves nearby. The caves held mysteries, darkness, thick spider webs, odd-shaped bones, slimy walls, moss, and strange sounds. Scared off by some noises or movements, we rushed down the hills like mountain goats, feet barely touching the ground, zigzagging past gravelly stones, clusters of irises and poppies, tufts of grass, and an assortment of bramble bushes. At times, we imagined ourselves to be Maccabees, an ancient Hebraic army fighting the evil forces that threatened us. Our mighty wooden swords and homemade bows and arrows overwhelmed our mock enemies in our quixotic play. Each adventure and activity created favorable experiences and memories, and like a montage, produced fluidity and wholesomeness. Finally, I felt I belonged. I was fully engaged in the fabric of everyday life. My fondest memories of that time were the holidays. I loved Purim when my sister was dressed as Queen Esther and I was dressed and danced as a Cossack. Sukkot, the harvest festival, was my favorite. The sukkah, the communal feasts that were prepared, were unforgettable. Building my first sukkah from strong wooden branches, 2 inches thick, evenly staked into the earth, 2 feet apart, was not just a collaborative effort, but symbolically a recognition of my own personal harvest. The sukkah was shaped into a rectangular pattern, and we wove young sapling branches horizontally in and out between every other vertical branch, creating secure walls on 3 sides. Patches of sky showed between the roof branches, and clusters of grapes and thin branches laden with green olives were hung on the interior walls. On a rough wooden table lay baskets of carrots, potatoes, cabbages, leeks, and melons. The cacophony of sounds, the buzzing of bees and flies, the croaking of frogs, and the distant high-pitched howls of jackals, blended with the pungent perfume of fresh ripened fruits and vegetables. All this, under a canopy of stars, created a bacchanal for the senses that transported me to a place of peace and wonderment. And I think I'm going to read just one more and then open it up for questions, even though there's a lot of stuff. And maybe what I'll do, this is when we were in America and we moved to this chicken farm in Monticello, New York. And the nature of farms in general, if they're of a certain size, they will not only have the main house, maybe some other main houses, but also trailers in the back. And often these were trailers that were filled with day laborers. And so this is about that time. The trailers housed workers and day laborers. These people were rarely integrated into the social hub of the farm. They were usually poor white or black men who lived for themselves and were paid in the form of cash and/or groceries. There was a sense of transience about their lives, and they remained on the periphery like semi-domesticated dogs, never to be understood or trusted. Little did I realize that their experience mirrored my own marginalization. I never felt a sense of belonging. My life was as transient as theirs, but acknowledging the similarities was too painful, and I desperately identified with the owners of the chicken farm. I think I'll stop right here, aware that most of you have other things to do in your afternoons, but I'd love to hear any questions you might have. Yes?
I was wondering how your parents felt when they moved back to Amsterdam, and when you went visiting later, if it was in the same area of Amsterdam, same kind of old neighbors around?
Well, what's interesting is my parents, first of all, the whole experience of, they needed to go back to Holland because in order to receive World War II reparation monies, they needed to go back to the host country, to their birth country. And so here was another experience for me, and I'm sure for them, where I needed to separate from them again. Now there's irony there because in retrospect, it was extremely healthy for that to happen because the emotional umbilical cord had never been severed and needed to be severed. And that occurred while they were in Holland. They first went to Groningen, which is my birth city, and where they lived a good part of their lives. And they had a lovely place, and ironically, on a street called Onderduiker Street, which is underground street, Sheila and I visited them quite a few times over there. But my parents, sadly, because of the war, were continually dislocated. They never could form roots again. They lost many of their friends, of course, their work, their house, and so forth. And so when they came back, the only connection that they continued to have was with their children and extended family. And that actually they became very aware of, in that most of their extended family lived in Amsterdam. And so my father and his brother, both families, went to Amsterdam into a new development called Belmermeer. It was new at the time. It was sort of a suburb of Amsterdam. And what was interesting about this complex was that there was no traffic going through it. It had to go around this situation. So in a way, it was quite tranquil. But as I said, their primary reason for going was to be closer to other members of the family who also had gone to America and then had to come back. In later years, by 1975, 5 years after they were there, the government and a German administration that funded a lot of the reparation monies said you no longer had to live in your birth country. And my parents actually wanted to come back to America at that point, and through some peculiar reason, they reached out to me and asked if that would be okay, which I thought was extremely polite and somewhat unusual. But when I thought about it, I wasn't ready to receive them yet. I was still going through too much turmoil, and I had not even begun, well, maybe I had my own personal therapy and so forth. So I asked them if they didn't mind waiting for a while, and in 1980, when they reached out again, I was very ready to receive them back. I was in this different stage of life. I became an American citizen. Within a year thereafter, I was a father. Sheila and I raised our child, and we looked forward to seeing them. But that was the whole cycle beyond that. Did you have a question? I thought you had. Yeah.
First, I want to thank Rena for hosting this event. It's interesting that you mentioned that your affiliation with the Quakers in Friend's house.
Yeah.
Is that something that came about because you converted to?
No, I did not. But it's funny that you should use that word converted, because Quakers and I are like this. Over 40 years of my life, since 1980, when I started working at Friends Seminary, I've been involved not only as an employee, but later as a trustee, involved in a variety of different projects. And I've always been extremely attracted by not only their spiritual ideals, but their ability to make decisions without creating new ones, you know, and even their business management. The ability to form committees and to have agendas that include everyone in the process, seeking unity. All of those things are important to me, and I try to live them. And so, and to tell you something else, which really made me extremely gratified. So in the beginning of my life, I was saved by Christians. And in terms of my future, when I die, I'm going to be buried in a Quaker cemetery in Prospect Park. I don't know if you know Prospect Park, but there's a Quaker cemetery there, very quaint, on a hill. I think you could see the Empire State Building from there. And so that's where I'll be buried. And that made me feel very restful, very much at peace, almost like bookends in a sense.
I'll just interject in personal. My mother was a Holocaust survivor, and she was deported to south of France. And the Quakers were very instrumental in terms of rescuing children from the camps and placing them in different homes. I know Eleanor Roosevelt was very much involved with the Quakers in this movement to try to help rescue Jewish children that were in south of France. So I just thought I'd mention that.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that as well, and obviously they have a rich, vibrant history, which perversely includes someone named Nixon, who was a Quaker, or at least whose mother, I think, was a Quaker. Again, people are people.
How did your parents, you mentioned in 1949, your parents found it difficult to live in Holland, and then, but they spent a lot of time in Israel and this country and the United States. How did they get more comfortable with being back in Holland after having felt the shadows and the ghosts of history that surrounded them?
Well, the interesting thing is that my parents, as I said before, never were able to form roots in really any community. They were almost like living in a bubble. And so they had an illusion of what Holland was going to be like in 1970. And they thought, I think, without even articulating it, that it would be like what it was before the war. And so they were looking at it through a prism of their own youth, of when they had lots of energy and they belonged to athletic clubs, and my mother was very political, and so on and so forth. So they were, I think, within a very short while after they came to Holland, and they became somewhat jaded because it wasn't all that they had hoped for, and so therefore the only life spasm that helped them continue their lives in some manner. And I don't want to paint a picture of doom and gloom, because they had wonderful times as well, but there were always shadows of a different sort behind them and above them, was living through the extended family. In fact, a little quick aside on that. While they were in the States, every Friday evening, the extended family would get together in one person's house or another. And I don't know if some people remember the Gillette razor-sponsored boxing fights on Friday night. They were still going on in the 70s and 80s on black and white TVs, I remember. And when my parents and extended family would get together, and they would have highballs to drink and other such mixed drinks, and or Dutch gin. Eventually, from a quiet, civil environment where they talked about their children and their work weeks and so on and so forth, it suddenly turned to politics. And my father was ultra-conservative, and he was very much a patriot, and he was like that whichever country he was in. He always, and I don't know if that was his true conviction or he was so worried about rocking the boat, I'm not sure. But they would have these horrific arguments that were almost, at some point, children fighting amongst themselves, you know, in some way. And then at the end of the evening, they would kiss each other goodbye, and I'm sure there were several wounds here or there. My sister and I would call that the Friday night fights. And you know, it was so mixed with tea drinking and bonbons and roast beef slices and all of those things, but sooner or later, alcohol inspired, they went to a place that I think was difficult for all of them. Any other questions? Yes, Caroline.
Fear of abandonment is such a source of suffering for mankind.
Yeah, yeah.
If you were able to give one piece of advice to somebody who was dealing with the trauma of that, what would it be?
That's always a very interesting question, and in some ways, what I will say may end up being very plastic, because it's something that is experiential. You really have to live through it. And I think for me, it's not that it is evaporated. It's just, again, put into perspective. So it's in my back pocket instead of in my throat, in a way, or in my eye, in the sense that I have to remind myself in those moments what I've done and what state of being I'm now in. And that creates such a gravity and an ability to stand and feel my own weight and remain whole within my skin that it wards off those terrible, corrosive feelings that can easily overwhelm one. So I just have to remember, this is not all that you are, and in fact it now is a small part of who you are. So
in many respects, the answer is within us.
It's absolutely within us. It's not something that can be directed from anywhere else. We have to go through that maze sometimes on a daily basis, you know? Yeah.
Thank you, Joe.
Any other questions?
Like,
Yeah?
how many languages do you speak?
Well, interestingly, so I speak 75 or 80-year-old Dutch, and I say it like that on purpose because I'm fluent in it. I can easily make my way around Holland. I will say that people usually come and say, are you from the south? You know, that's already derogatory. The south of Holland, or worse, are you Flemish? Yeah, so because there are a lot of words that are missing, you know, it's old Dutch, but I understand it, and I should add that when I hear people talking in Dutch on the street, I immediately think they're an aunt or uncle. There's that kind of simpatico that I feel. I also speak a little bit of Spanish. I speak a little bit of Arabic because I took Arabic for a number of years. And I was fluent at one time in Hebrew. The problem was that we never spoke it at home. So I lost it. And although there's an interesting sidebar on that, which is that I was never bar mitzvahed. However, there was a point when I was studying to be bar mitzvahed, and my aunt, who was our host in America, was going to sponsor it also in terms of funding it. And so at that time, I spoke Hebrew fluently. And I ended up correcting the rabbi all the time because I didn't like the way he enunciated the words, and I didn't find it difficult at all. But I found it interesting that I had the nerve and the chutzpah, in a way, to tell this man with a somewhat cracking, high-pitched voice, that's not how you say it. You know? So those are the languages. What I try to speak more actively than any other language outside of English, of course, is Arabic, actually. It's a language that I really like the ring of it, and there are lots of things in terms of a generalized Arabic culture that I happen to like. And inside of me, it may even be a political statement because I have very strong feelings about Israeli domestic policy. Not their foreign policy, but the way they treat Palestinians and some other Arabic people leaves a lot to be desired and is reminiscent of, sadly, different minorities in this country, beginning with Native Americans. So, so that's a sadness. Having said that, next year, for the first time in 60+ years, 65 years, I'm going to Israel. I decided, because the country is so dear to me, the land itself is so dear to me, and the kibbutz that I lived on, that I want to go there at a time when I can still appreciate life. So, yeah. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you so much for coming out. And if you haven't, feel free to take any of the bookmarks that are over there. And if you've bought the book, I'm willing to sign it. If you want to buy the book, I have books. If not, you can get it through Oblong, Amazon, all of those normal places. Thanks for showing up. Thank you. You're welcome.
What's your name?
I'm Dale Travis.
Dale Travis, it's wonderful to meet you.
Thank you.
Here at the Millerton Library, talking about Joe Gosler's Searching for Home. How did the story resonate with you?
Well, first, it was the first time I've heard a personal history of that experience. So that was very impressive. Next, I enjoyed hearing him speak. He presented himself beautifully, and we purchased his book. So,
That's wonderful.
I'm sorry that more people weren't here to hear it, because it was worth hearing.
Thank you so much. And for me too, I never heard stories particularly about hidden children during the war. It's almost as if you hear stories about so many other things, but never what happens to the children. So I find it very powerful in that way.
That it was, no question about it.
Thank you so very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Would you be kind enough to tell me your name?
Sigrid Freundorfer.
Oh my goodness me, that sounds that sounds Dutch.
No German.
German.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Well, it's great to see you here at the Millerton Library talking about Joe Gosler's Searching for Home. I'm a British person, so the story resonates for me in a certain way. Talk to me a little bit about how it resonated for you.
Well, I was first of all, fascinated by what he had to say, and having grown up in Europe, in Germany, basically in post-war Germany, there are just so many families that are equally affected by the war and are still around to tell important stories. And I wanted to hear how his life had gone since the war, and also how he felt going back to his native country, in a way, how he felt he fit in again or didn't. So
it's so interesting to think about how much displacement physically and emotionally and generationally. I think that's one of the things that I feel so strongly when I hear Joe's story. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I'm thinking of my own mother, who was from the Sudetenland. They were kicked out as ethnic Germans during the war when the Russians moved in, and they just fled, with the clothes on their back, and ended up wherever. So, there are just so many stories there, and people have so much to say that we should all learn from. Not that we ever do, or people ever do. It starts all over again.
Well, it seems very important at the moment, doesn't it?
Very much so. Yeah, exactly.
That we keep these stories alive.
And he was very fortunate, or the family was very fortunate to have such a nice Dutch family who, at their own peril, basically, took him in, because obviously the Nazis were everywhere.
And their story is an amazing one of courage and
and I was curious, actually, if he was still in touch with the two girls who were almost like his stepsisters at the time, because they obviously almost grew up together a little bit for a few years.
Yes. And I think, those roots, those connective roots are so powerful. And it just shows us that we're all connected. And
we're all
everything
connected,
is connected.
And then you think about it later and say, what separated us? Why? Why were they picked out? You know, what was so different? I mean, we all loved one another in a way, but, you know, history repeats itself. And
I think his description of the cobblestones and the boots on the cobblestones and the cleaning of the cobblestones and then
the wagon wheels
on.
and all of that. Sure, I can just hear it. Because those are the old historical towns that you have in Europe, that you would have in Holland, that you would have in Germany. And I'm sure the sounds had a lot to do with the way you experience things and how scared you might have been.
Absolutely. Sounds and smells. Bring it all back.
Yeah, so I really look forward to reading the book and learning more.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for talking to me, and enjoy Searching for Home.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Can you tell me what your name is?
My name is Kenda Ward.
Wonderful to meet you, Kenda.
Same here.
Great to see you at the Millerton Library talking about Joe Gosler's book, Searching for Home. How did it resonate with you?
It just touched me so much. As I told Joe in the beginning, I looked at the picture, I saw the baby. I have a 15-month-old grandson, and he was 20 months old, and he figures in that picture. And I just couldn't begin to think how I would feel if this was my grandson, or if this happened to my grandson. And as he was talking, I think he saw me start to tear up a little bit, and he looked away. I said, okay, calm down, because I was a pediatric nurse. I was a school nurse for a long time. And when I hear about the traumas that happen to the children, when I think of them, when I think of the orphan train and all the things that he was talking about that happened to him, and just being moved here and there, and his traumas with his parents, it just touched me so much. Bought the book. There it is. I think everybody should buy it. I think it's just so touching.
Well, it's wonderful to hear the perspective from the point of view of somebody who's worked with children all those years. Because I think I was when I asked the question to Joe about abandonment, I know so many people who are even entering the last decades of their life still traumatized by abandonment.
Yes.
And I'm sure you've experienced that in your work.
Oh, absolutely. And when he brought up one of the songs, Whitney Houston, Children Are Our Future, and when he said that the Nazis went after the kids because they're the future. Get rid of them first. I thought my heart clutched, clenched, whatever, because that's the way I feel. Children are our future. We have to invest in them. We have to teach them how to read. We have to teach them how to behave. We have to teach them how to be responsible citizens, responsible people, and to have that taken away, it just... it's horrifying. It's horrifying.
Well, thank you so much. It's wonderful to meet you, and I hope you enjoy Searching for Home.
I'm going home to read it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you. Hey, Rhiannon, thank you so much for having us here today at the Millerton Library.
Oh, thank you for coming. It's been a wonderful experience.
And how did you feel about Joe Gosler's Searching for Home?
It's not a story that you hear very often. I mean, we know that this happened, but to actually speak to someone who went through it and hear it directly from them, it's heartbreaking. It's so hard to put into words what it makes you feel.
And I think the emphasis on children during that war is something, as you say, we don't really get to hear about very much.
Yeah, there's one person in particular who actually, it's her 75th anniversary of her diary being published today. Did not intend that today when we scheduled it, but it's different to hear about how their lives were changed because of it, not recognizing their parents. That was the worst part. and not having that connection to build the rest of their life on. And how do you know how to interact with people once that has changed? Like, I mean, the trust of finding out that the people who thought you were parents were not your parents, and then being thrust into this new world that is not what you based your identity on. I can't imagine. It's a miracle that he's so happy and healthy and just a part of the world that he is. Like, there's so many other people would have just crumbled.
I think that's one of the most amazing things for me about Joe is he's one of the most elegant people that I know, and I think that wisdom that he's gained through that trauma and the sort of devastation of it and finding his way through it, for me is it's so inspiring.
Absolutely. I mean, more people need to hear it. Like, if you can go through all this and be okay, it really makes you realize what you can accomplish if you have the support, if you have the ability to ask for help. It's amazing.
Tell us a little bit about the library in Millerton.
Yes. Well, we're the NorthEast-Millerton Library. We serve a small community of about 3,000 people, and we are just very honored to be able to help our local artists and musicians and writers be able to be more known in the community. This is one of several events that we do throughout the year. We have local musicians playing all summer. It's just very important for us to support our community. There's so many talented people here that we want to be able to help them in some way, bring them to more attention, because we're a small community, but we have so talented people and so many fascinating stories that it's great to have this opportunity to be able to share that with everyone.
Thank you so much, and thank you for doing all you do for our community.
Thank you.
Thank you.